Ed, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
I consider you a friend of the show, a repeat guest, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know you. You are. I mean, look, I love saying at parties. Occasionally, I can say I have a friend who's a Roman historian. It's a great name dropping thing. And as the Republic is in decline, I say, you know what? I have a friend that's written about republics in decline. Let me tell you who he is. Ed Watts. And Ed, you have a new book, The Romans, a 2,000-year history. This is an ambitious project. I mean, people often, I think one of the challenges in academia in a specialized world is to do like a big project, right? To write something big. Do you have anxiety about the specialist is going to raise their hand and say, yeah, but this in the 7th century is not quite this way? Or I mean, is it daunting to take a sort of comprehensive big picture view in a discipline like this?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, it definitely is. On another level, I mean, I think it's really important to be able to speak to a wider set of people who can use the examples from the Roman past to think about things that we're experiencing now, and in particular to think about the different paths that we might have, and just broaden the frameworks that we use to think about change in the world, how change unfolds, when change is sustainable, when it becomes, very difficult to see. And I think if you are drilling down and working really specifically in a particular time period or moment, and I've done that. I've done a micro history before. Um, it's a different kind of process. It's a process where you really have to think seriously about how the contours, the physical contours, the sort of literary contours, the cultural contours of a very specific moment work. When you're working in a big picture and you're telling a sort of long narrative, what you're more interested in is the connective tissue that makes the experience of many, many, many generations come together. And I think with Rome, what you have is this really remarkable thing where you have about 80 generations of citizens who all kind of feel like this political enterprise that they're participating in is something that they inherited from the people who came before them, and they have an obligation to give to the people who are coming next, and ideally do it in a better condition than they got it. And there's something remarkable about that. But what that does is it makes it much more, it makes it impossible, really, to do a micro history while also looking at these big trends. But that doesn't mean the big trends are a problem to look at. It means, we have to step back and acknowledge that much of what goes on in a human society involves day-to-day interactions, minute-to-minute interactions, but also these really, really long-term intergenerational interactions. And all that's happening at once, and to understand history, you have to be able to appreciate all of the different phases, all of the different sort of, if we think of like waves, the very short term waves, the very, the medium term waves, and then the very, very long term waves. And all of that's going on at once, all of these paths that societies are taking, they're all happening at one time. And you just have to tell the story differently depending on what you're looking at and why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge of history, right? In that if you're too abstract, you're not really doing history, right? You're kind of up in the clouds. But if you're too particular, I mean, you have to be abstract enough to be able to tell a story, right? Because otherwise, I mean,
Yeah.
facts themselves, brute facts aren't anything, right? I mean, a story has to be told, and facts don't tell a story. Facts are just that; they're just facts, right? They're just data points. They're not. I mean, and historians, you got to put the story in history, right?
Exactly. History is about people. If you're not telling the story of people, you aren't really doing proper history. History is really, and this is why I think history is in a sense something that we're always going to be interested in, because history done right is the history of people that you never met, but you can identify the basic humanity of them, and you can understand the challenges and the tensions and the anxieties and the disappointments and the trauma that they feel. And history told right does all of those things. History done right, it brings these people that we can recover from our material sources and from our literary sources, and even from things like coins. We can recover things about these people, and we can tell a story about them. And ultimately, we learn about ourselves by learning about their stories.
I'm curious a little bit about your story because I first encountered you when I read Mortal Republic. I think your publicist, who I knew, pitched. He said, "Hey, this is a book, a guest. I think you'd be interested." And I loved the book, and that book has really shaped me. I still talk about that book. But I mean, that book was incredibly well received and widely reviewed. And I mean, did you imagine? I mean, and some of this is I mean, sadly, I mean, or you had the good fortune or misfortune of writing about the decline of a republic into an autocratic reality, as in 2016, and so in the era of, in the era of Trump. Did that change you? I mean, I wonder how that shaped you as a historian, writing something that was so timely. I mean, I'm sure you weren't in grad school thinking, you know what, I'm going to time out a book that's going to be so great. And when people are worried about the deterioration of the American Republic, that's when I'm going to make. I mean, you don't game things out like that in graduate
Yeah.
school, right? I mean, how did it change you?
Yeah, I think that with that book, what I realized is things happen that you don't intend, right? Stories that you think are going to go in one direction go in a different one. So I started that book actually thinking, the villain that I'm talking about is Mitch McConnell, and the sort of the Catonian restriction on the process of government and the damage that does. And I thought that we would really be thinking about the timeline as something like we're in the 60s BC. We're not in the 40s BC. We're not in the 50s BC. We're really in this moment where everybody still wants a republic. Everybody still thinks they're living under a republic, but everybody trusts it just too little, just a little bit too little, to actually trust that their interests are actually going to play out in the long term. And so they start gaming the republic. And in Rome, that happens in the 60s, and that was really happening during the Obama administration. And so the book I thought I was writing was a book talking about why it's so dangerous to be gaming the republic, and why it's so dangerous to be playing at the margins. And with the election of Trump, all of a sudden it moved from, really kind of arcane gamesmanship in the Senate to like the executive branch is gaming the system alongside elements of the Supreme Court. And, the emergency became way more significant and way more immediate. Was, in a sense, a movement forward from, games in the Senate in a Roman context in like 63, 62, 61 BC to, maybe the consulship of Caesar, where you have a lot more gaming going on, both within the Senate and then with people outside of the Senate who are actually executives implementing policy. Um, but what that did for me was it made me realize, first of all, you can't write a project to the moment because you'll miss your moment, right? I wrote to a moment that, had I been explicit about what I was trying to do, the book wouldn't work at all. I mean, the moment is a precursor to what we're living through, or what we were living through in 2017, 2018, 2019. So if you write to a moment, maybe you get lucky, but probably you won't. Probably you'll miss it. What I wanted to do with this book is write something a little bit, I suppose, more timeless. What Roman history has been about for a very, very long time is why the Roman state falls, why it collapses. And very few people write the history of the entire Roman state. The last person that I found to do it was Montesquieu. And Montesquieu was doing it not in a narrative form, but in a set of essays where he's basically trying to understand why the Republic could be so successful that after it disappeared, you still have this like 1500 years of Roman history that continues. And what I thought was a problem with the way Montesquieu is doing this is, I mean, first of all, he's not doing a narrative. But second of all, he's working from this teleological premise that history moves in a specific direction. And there's an endpoint to it. And for Rome, when it lost its representative government, it was so far ahead of the world that it basically just sort of had a lead that it held for 1500 years until somebody surpassed it. And that's just wrong. I mean, no society can do that. A society that is that doesn't change, that doesn't evolve, that, just lives off of its past glories, it falls very quickly because the world moves quickly. And if you don't move, you're going to be surpassed. So I wanted to write a history of why Rome succeeds, not a history of why Rome fails, but why Rome succeeds. And I think what I found was there's a really important balance that we right now are starting to lose, not just in the United States, but around the world. I mean, what Rome does best is it evolves, but it evolves in a way that is slow and steady. And, the new is tempered by the traditions of the Roman past. And this idea that you are part of a heritage, you're part as a citizen of Rome. You basically are renting your position at the top of that state from the previous generation so you can give it to the next generation. And that means that you can't scrap the previous generation's stuff. You have to work to make it evolve slowly so you don't lose that connection to the past. And that's something I think we are missing right now.
Yeah, you lay that out beautifully in the beginning of the book in a passage I love. You're sort of critiquing traditional periodization of Roman history. You say, no Roman woke up in 300 BC and thanked the gods that she had made it out of early Roman history and entered the Middle Republic. And no one from the medieval Eastern Roman Empire would understand the modern decision to strip their recent ancestors of their Romanness and call them Byzantines on the day Constantinople was dedicated in AD 330. And that strikes me that through the book, I mean, there's this sense in which you're saying we've sort of taken an identity. I think like the idea of Byzantine studies and all this stuff, that we've sort of said, well, no, the togas and that sort of, the Shakespeare and all that, that's this. And then there's something else over here that's different. And you're saying, no, that this would have been news to these people that they weren't Romans. That in Byzantium, centuries out, long after the action moves from Italy, they thought they were just as Roman as the people as lead characters in a Shakespearean tragedy, right?
Right. Yeah, because for them, and I think for all Romans, there are things that we might call like a national identity, but really what there is citizenship. They're part of, they are stakeholders in this enterprise. And what happens from the transition to from republic to empire that I think people miss is that citizenship is still there. It still matters, right? Emperors themselves said, we're citizens. We are magistrates. We're governed by the law, just like other citizens. And if we weren't, how would we have any authority to do anything that affects other citizens, right? And so they're not kings. Emperors are not kings. Emperors are people who hold a lifelong magistracy. It's a very powerful magistracy, but at least in their minds, I mean, the emperors themselves say this. They say this is something entrusted to us by representatives of our fellow citizens, by representatives of the Roman people. And so that connection that Romans feel is very much state-based. And as long as you're living in that state, why would you think something different has happened? The corporation maybe has shrunk. Maybe the shares are less valuable. You're still part of it. You still own it. Just like Cato owned it. Just like, Brutus owned it. Just like Julius Caesar owned it, right? You are in the year 1000 in Constantinople, you hold a share in this Roman state and it's valuable. And it's the same state that was there 1,000 years before.
Yeah. And one of the stories that I want to get into some of the particular of the history sketch, but some of the big pictures, one of the things I appreciate is the story you tell about the consistent capacity, not just to evolve, but to incorporate, that it's a success that's built on addition, not subtraction.
Yeah.
That Rome is constantly figuring out ways. And use the stakeholder idea, right? More and more people are stakeholders, which is remarkable to me. I don't think if you ask the average person in the West, but because we're all undereducated around ancient history and things, right? Well, among most things, that's going to change because we've got Linda McMahon now, and we're going to have the best history, the best education in the country, in the world. But you don't think of. I think most people don't think of Rome as an integration story, a story of addition. And the other thing you say, it's a story of addition and scale. You write earlier in the book, you say Romans didn't invent representative democracy or monotheism or the concept of citizenship. but they did figure out how to make these ideas work on a larger scale than anyone in the ancient world had thought previously possible.
Yeah.
That's so. I mean, can you tell me? Addition and scale seem like two big ideas to understand your big picture of Roman history.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I think addition, Romans, when they told their own story, they saw at the very beginning of their state this idea of like taking in newcomers, right? If you have something to offer, we want to take you in. Like the story of Romulus and like how he settles Rome. He takes the people discarded by other places, exiles and criminals and, people who didn't have a homeland anymore. He brings them in. With the Sabine women, there is, of course, violence, right? He kidnaps them, but then he negotiates something where the state becomes this hybridized state that also has a Sabine representation in the core. So, like at the very beginning of Rome, the stories they tell about themselves are stories of incorporation. It's not like we are these, ethnically pure people who descended from somewhere and like started this place. This place started with a mix of people. We've always been a mix of people. And what we do when we expand is we find what these new people can do to make us better, do to make us work better. And if we find somebody outside who's spectacular, let's bring them in and bring them in at a high level. So whatever sort of tools and skills and resources they have, we all can benefit from it. And this is why Rome would even make kings out of immigrants. The legendary fifth king of Rome, who was not a legendary person, but there I think were many more than four kings before him, is a man named Tarquinius Priscus, who came from the city of Tarquinia and was descended from Corinthian refugees. It's not a problem for Rome to say this guy is really talented. He's got a lot of resources. He's got a lot of skills. Let's put him in charge. And so I think this is something that historically reflects like the mid part of Italy in this moment, where there's just a lot of people moving around. It is something that if you don't have good institutions for integrating people, it's going to be tremendously destabilizing, because if those people can't find a place in your society, they're going to make a place for themselves, maybe by force. So Rome has a lot of incentive to work this way, but it also knows how to do it in a way that no one in antiquity could. So, when Rome is, say, fighting Carthage, Rome has a citizen body that's many times the size of Carthage, and they're dedicated and devoted citizens, willing to fight harder than Carthaginians, the people in Carthaginian armies would fight. And so, Rome's success comes from being able to identify what you can get by bringing in new people, but then also figuring out how you can bring in new people without losing your sense of who you are. And so so you have a sense of what Roman is, what it means to be part of this political community, and you have the ability to communicate that to other people in a way that's meaningful and makes them invested in that process of embracing Romanness. And you see it over and over and over again. You see it in Italy in the 3rd century BC. You see it in Gaul in the 1st century BC. You see it in Britain in the 1st century AD. Over and over and over again, they know how to do this, and people are receptive.
You bring up the whole Carthage. Actually, one of the things that I'm blown away by in your history is just building a navy. Like, there's no navy. Like,
Yeah.
all right, guys, I just imagine what the gall it takes to say, like, okay, all right, guys, I know that we've not done this before. We're building ships. We're going to build a lot of them, and I know we don't really know how to do this. We're going to practice rowing on the. I mean, like this kind of stuff. This is remarkable to me that you have the vision to just do this from scratch.
Yeah, no, it's craziness. So the story there is
Like, we can't build light rail. Or high speed rail, right? I mean, we you guys have that high speed project, that you can't get built. No, we can't build.
you can
They
take a
could just
train to
say
Modesto.
they could just say, hey, you know what? We don't have a navy, but that's not going to stop us.
Yeah, basically, Carthage has the best navy, certainly in the region and maybe in the Mediterranean world. It's world class, and it is really, really hard to fight a naval battle in antiquity, because you're basically doing, it's almost like a boxing match with rams, where you're trying to use this metal spike to puncture the hull of the other ship, which then, if the people are not so smart to leave it, it will sink. But if they jump off the ship just sits there. It still floats because it's buoyant, even with a hole in it. And so, it's really hard to win these naval battles because, even if you do it right and you puncture a ship, you still have to somehow work around the like ghost ship that's sitting there. And the Romans are totally undeterred, right? They have to fight a war against Carthage. They have to somehow get forces to Sicily. They have to somehow, take control of the central part of the Mediterranean. And they don't have, not only do they not have like a first world navy, they don't have a navy at all. And so they get a single Carthaginian ship that runs aground in a storm, and they reverse engineer the entire thing. And then, like you said, while they're building these ships, like huge numbers of them at once, they don't have anywhere for their rowers to practice. So they make them practice synchronizing their strokes on the beach, sitting on basically boards. This shouldn't work. And
I wouldn't have made it. I would have quit. I would have not made it as a Roman. I just did the grit that it takes. I mean, at that point when they're saying we're rowing on the beach, I would have just like put me in the Colosseum. Just feed me to the lions. I'm not. It seems like a lot of grit to be a Roman.
oh yeah, and and they know these guys are like gonna die, and the guys know they're gonna die too, right? I mean, it's like I saw somewhere that the fatality rate for like German U-boat crews is over 65% in World War II. Some crazy number of people knew they'd go into this thing and probably were going to die, but it was essential for the cause to do it. And so Roman sailors who are sitting there on the beach learning how to row know they're probably going to lose their first battle. And in their first battle, I mean, not only do they lose, they run away, which is like terrifying to Romans. And so what Romans then do is they invent this spiked gangplank, and they put Marines on the ships, and then they just sail right up to a Carthaginian ship and drop the plank and then take the thing over using Marines because, hey, I mean, we know how to do that, right? We might not be able to outsail the Carthaginians, but we can outfight the sailors.
You got to play
And
to your strengths.
yeah, and it restores Romans' faith in this enough that they're willing to actually go and contest naval battles. But I think it's remarkable that every Roman there, again, has this mindset of we're part of something. We're part of something that's multi generational. And each of us has a role to play at this particular moment in making sure that this thing emerges better than it was before. And that, that what we give to our kids is better than what we were given by our parents. And if that means I sit on the beach and I learn to row so I can die in like 3 weeks, that's what it means, right? Rome asked me to do it. I'm a citizen. This is what I do. And ideally, it puts my kids in a better position than I was. And my kids don't have to do it. It's not a mentality that I think we're very familiar with in the 21st century. I mean, we don't think this way. But I think this is a key part of what that citizenship meant, right? Like it didn't mean I have privileges. I mean, you did have privileges, but it also meant I had obligations. And those obligations are, just as powerful, if not more powerful than the privileges. And a society that can work that way will have people willing to make those kinds of sacrifices. And, and obviously, like, that's hard for us to understand because that's not what our society asks of us.
Now, I even think of like the sense of during World War II. I mean, during World War II, I remember reading some political story in the 20th century was talking about just how many people post-war in the House and the Senate had all served in both parties, right? And you had this sense in which, what was the recruitment? Like Uncle Sam pointing, "I want you," and that's it. Like your country needs you. And now you look at the military; it's like it's a jobs program, right? It's a be all you can be. It's a self-actualization. It's not obligation. It's sort of it's not duty. It's sort of this is a college alternative, right?
Yeah.
This is a very different moment. I want to ask you. You mentioned Rome's fifth king. One of the things that I think is interesting when you're doing ancient history, which I don't know. I mean, I've studied the only ancient history I've studied is through biblical studies and things like that. But there's always this question that where does myth end and history begin, right? Where are the stories myth and legend, and where are we actually putting our hand on material about people we're pretty confident that actually walked around and I'm sure that we have legends about them, but they're not all legend, right? That these are actual
Yeah.
people. Where for you as a Roman historian, where does the myth end and the actual history of actual figures begin?
That's actually, I mean, that's a great question because there's a moment where Livy, who's the great sort of Latin historian who gives us early Rome, there's a moment where Livy basically says, and this is like well after I think we have actual figures that lived. He says, I don't really know what happened here, but to quote Will Ferrell, it's kind of there's truthiness to it, right? Like it's yeah, like I don't really know, but this seems more or less right, so I'm gonna retell it, and I'll be fully honest that I don't really know, but it seems about this is kind of the trajectory I think makes some sense, and and that's already that's in the 5th century BC, right? He's already in this moment where we have actual documents from the 5th century BC, not many, but we have actual documents from very earliest Rome. I think could we say Romulus ever existed? I don't know. I mean, I think you could maybe say a guy named Romulus could potentially have existed. I don't think that the second and third kings are historical figures. Ancus Marcius, I think, is a historical figure. He's the fourth king, but I don't think much of what's said about what he did is actually real. I think we really know. I accept that he's a real person because there's a coup launched by his kids against Tarquinius Priscus, and Tarquinius Priscus, I think, was a real person. There's just too much information about him and his wife from later periods that attests to the fact that they existed. Like people in the 1st century AD could talk about like seeing her sandals and seeing stuff like that she had woven and statues of her. And the Emperor Claudius in 48 AD can talk about Tarquinius Priscus in a way that's meaningful. The sixth king, we have material that's Etruscan that talks about him, as well as Latin and Greek material. So we're in a period where these people existed. And I think we can say, as you start moving into the 5th and 6th kings, you can even start saying some stuff about what they did that I think is reasonably strongly attested. And, by the time you have the overthrow of Tarquinius Superbus, not only did he exist, but, he's an actual actor that you can see doing stuff and engaging in like political tensions where there's just no question that.
It's interesting you say Claudius, the details she's telling about something, because I've often heard people talk about the Gospels and generally people trying to make a case for their historical reliability, and they tend to say, well, one of the arguments they make is there's a lot of detail, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, Jesus fell asleep at this end of the book, like that doesn't do much for symbol or anything, right? And they say that that these sort of, at least some of the stuff seems to be based on some sort of recollection, right? Because when you have detail like that doesn't serve some symbolic point in the story or something, it's like, oh, okay, maybe this is real recollection, right?
I'm kind of a gospel maximalist in that like I think when you start getting materials in like the 60s, which is when the earliest materials is coming together, I think you have such a desire by the people who are putting this together, people like Mark and whoever's putting together Q. There's such a desire to put this stuff together while the people who heard it are still alive, right? Because you're still in the generation that heard Jesus. These guys didn't, but they have things where they're really, really interested in maintaining a fidelity to the actual connection with Jesus, and they're engaging in a project that's difficult because they're taking Aramaic Jesus and making him Greek Jesus. And I think part of this is again just me.
I like this. When you say that, I think of Dogma when they bring out the buddy Jesus. It's just like, they gotta get rid of Aramaic Jesus. We need a Greek Jesus here, guys.
Yeah, but
If
but
we're
in a
gonna
weird
make the
way,
empire, if we're gonna take this place by storm, we need a Greek Jesus.
but everything he does is so important, right? Like, and so the challenge is going from Aramaic to Greek. Like, you have to maintain Jesus. You just have to render him. And I think my feeling is part of why Mark is so awkward is because Mark's really struggling to do that, right? His Greek is awkward because he's really struggling to say like, I don't want to distort Jesus, right? Like, that connection, that like human connection to Jesus, it's like going away now. There aren't people left anymore, and by the time I'm done, there might not be anybody left. So I want to be sure that like I'm as I'm as connected to what was going on as I can be, because we don't want to lose that connection. Like we don't want to like distort Jesus away, because Jesus is like important, right? Like everything Jesus said is gold, and you don't want to like mess it up by doing a bad translation. And so I think that again, that's just me. Like when I read this, I see somebody who's like trying really, really hard not to write something that's pretty, but to write something that's accurate. And I think, if we were to step back and say, like, do I trust something that a story that somebody told me from 30 years ago? Yeah, I would trust it. Would I trust that every detail is right? I don't know. But like I have a friend, we're having a conversation about Muhammad Ali, and he mentioned meeting Muhammad Ali at a benefit dinner. And this is after Ali, this is in the 90s, right? So Ali, the Parkinson's had started to hit, and Ali recognized him because they'd met before. But Ali came in late, and he spent the whole evening kind of holding on to my friend's shoulder so he didn't fall over. That was 30 years ago, right? I mean, that's basically the distance from Jesus to Mark. Do I doubt that story? No. I mean, do I think there are details that he might have forgotten? Maybe. But that is so meaningful to him that he's going to remember a lot more than if it's like, hey, I went to the store to buy milk on like June 30th, 1994,
And I'm going to quote you. I'm going to say, hey, look, I have it on a good ancient historian's word. It's good to be a gospel maximalist. This is a term I've never heard before, but I'm I remember one time when I was in doing doctoral work at Princeton Seminary, I was the karaoke DJ at the D bar, the grad pub. And one of the guys I worked with, who was one of the door guys, he was an ancient history. He was a classicist, and he says, "What's up with you guys over at the seminary?" I said, "What do you mean? Like, what's weird?" He says, "Guys are obsessive," and I'm like, "Well, and what do you mean?" He's like, "Wait, guys are all text criticism and this ancient text, and look how old." He said, like I work on Plato. If the oldest copy we had of the Republic was like it would be like if the New Testament, the oldest copy of Mark we had was 1400 years old. He's like, it doesn't bother us that we don't have all these ancient manuscripts. He's like, it's just, why do you guys obsess about it? And that I was blown away by that, because I just probably hadn't thought about manuscript traditions and how close to the autographs do we have? And I'm just curious, to you as an ancient historian, I mean, you're dealing with ancient sources. The New Testament's obviously kind of a unique thing in that, right? Because of this obsession of the copying and all this stuff, and we have all these early copies of copies of copies. But I mean, we have stuff that goes back. Like I think a friend of mine he's an ancient historian guy. He handled like something from the early 2nd century of Mark in a museum in London. I mean, this is how good are the sources you're working with regarding text transmission and text criticism, and how do you negotiate all that as an ancient historian, especially when you're working on a big project?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is that's really important that I realized in working across this is there are these break points, and this is really interesting given where we're living. There are break points in the media that are used to transmit knowledge. So, so the earliest period where we have Roman history, they're not writing anything, right? They don't even have writing. Then they have records, but the break point for them is the Gallic sack of Rome that destroys a lot of their records in 390, 386 BC. But that's a Rome specific thing. But as you get into the 4th century AD, there's a real shift in the way that knowledge is produced and accessed, that has actually a lot to do with Christianity and Christological arguments. There's a great book by Mark Letney that talks about those. But basically, what you have is a move from reading scrolls that you read sequentially, you read out loud, and it's very hard to kind of back check stuff in a scroll, right? You have to unroll the thing and you have to read it, and the Greek in there, the words are not differentiated. So it is something designed to be read sequentially and aloud. Starting in the 4th century, you start getting codices. These are books. And those can be consulted in the way that like we consult works of reference. And so you start thinking about knowledge differently. You start thinking about knowledge as something that can be consumed sequentially and read aloud and appreciated for its rhetorical qualities. And then it becomes something that you can like check, right? And you read it silently, because what are you doing? You're skimming until you find the thing that you're interested in. Um, there's benefits to that, especially if you're making Christological arguments. Like I want to use 9 gospel quotes to support this, and I want to use like these quotes from Origen and Clement to support my gospel quotes. And so a codex is a really useful thing. But what it means is eventually the medium for storing knowledge becomes centered not on preserving scrolls in piles on shelves, but preserving books. And so what happens as a result of that is like people stop producing scrolls. And if there are things that are on scrolls that are interesting, you copy them into books so you can keep them. But if they're not interesting, you don't. It's not that you destroy them. It's just that they don't make the cut to that next, medium. In the same way that like if we have something that's a book that's not super interesting and it doesn't get digitized, and every university library, like mine, is getting rid of physical books, that thing is going to go away. And it's not because it was bad, and it's not because it got banned by the government. It's just because it wasn't in the queue to get rendered into the new medium. And then you have a couple other moments like this as well. So in the eighth, early ninth century, there's a whole process where the Carolingians starts like vacuuming up everything they can find that's ancient, and assembling it in major monasteries like Fulda. And a huge portion of the Latin literature we have from antiquity, we have because of that. And it's about systematizing the collection and then the copying of knowledge from a previous period into new media. And then there's, a similar thing going on in Constantinople. And then you have a shift in the way that writing is done. And so at each of these choke points, you have to acknowledge as a historian, there's going to be stuff that's lost, and random things will make it through, right? So you do have pieces of, say, like Xenophon as the historian that we use, that the Byzantines, people we would call Byzantines, but the Romans in medieval Constantinople would use to do the history of the 4th century BC. But there's a better historian who is lost, except someone found a papyrus of his work in the city of Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. His work is better. It's more reliable. It just didn't make the cut. And so we have pieces of it because we found something that predates, the codex. But it's an accident that we have it. And if we didn't have it, if we didn't have that particular accidental find, we wouldn't know about this guy at all. And we don't know his name. He's just called the Oxyrhynchus historian. So I think as a historian, like working across this big span, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of what we have comes from the interests of the people alive at those choke points. So, we have tons of patristic stuff from the 4th and 5th centuries because like all that's actually going straight into codexes. I mean, all of that's going straight into books. So when you have the next choke point in Constantinople where they're copying the books from the 4th and 5th century, all that stuff is there, including like guys who sat in church while John Chrysostom gave every single sermon in his life, and they just wrote down every single word. I mean, we have more
And you know what?
Chrysostom.
I've read some of the sermons. They all seem to end the same way to me. No matter what the text is, no matter what the theme is, don't go to the games, don't go to the theater, and don't go to the synagogue.
And don't eat while I'm talking.
Don't even, yeah. These things are, it seems like the guy was repetitive to me.
Yeah. Well, if you had every single thing that a guy said multiple times a day sometimes, yeah, it would he would have his greatest hits he'd fall back on.
You talk about the interesting, you call the foundation of the Republic kind of an aristocratic counter-revolution, which I find fascinating. It's a great phrase. But you say that the Republic emerges out of this crazy period of 200 years of conflict. I think you say basically that that's just mind-blowing. There are really two governments in one state, right? You have this aristocratic kind of government and one that's much more staffed and in the interest of military folks. And these things are in conflict, and somehow something unimaginable in modernity you have a republic that emerges out of two governments in the same state in conflict, and the whole thing holds together and evolves into something more integrated and organic. I mean, how the hell does that happen?
I think there's a couple things going on that are remarkable and remarkably Roman. So I think the first thing is when the republic is set up, what had happened with the previous two kings is, the process for selecting a king was that the patricians, who were the hereditary aristocracy, would pick somebody, and everybody else, who were called the plebeians, would vote to approve this or not approve it. But because the hereditary aristocracy was hereditary, plebeians, like the richest plebeians, were as rich and as significant socially and economically as the richest patricians. And so, you have this like default that we have after Marx to like look at everything as a class struggle, but this isn't a class struggle at all. And so there's an incentive for both of these groups to play nicely. So when the patricians set up the republic, what they do is they set it up as something where basically it's like the kingship, except there are magistracies that patricians hold, and they pick who's going to hold those magistracies, and then plebeians vote to approve it or not. And so in their mind, what they're doing is they're basically going back to the way the kingship had been before it had gotten hijacked. But there's no king. There's now just a cycling of magistracies between patricians. And plebeians effectively say, well, wait a second. Like the only thing that separates the richest, separates you from the richest of us is this hereditary standing. And we're not going to accept that. And so they set up their own government. And the problem that they face is the problem that both of these guys face is they do not have enough power to force the other group to do what they want. So the plebeians are rich enough and powerful enough and numerous enough that if they chose to force the issue, they really could overwhelm the patricians, right? Because the patricians are a relatively small group, plebeians are a large group, and they make up most of the army. But economically, the leading plebeians have no interest in doing this because it would destroy their economic position. And patricians obviously have no interest in doing this because they would lose, right? If they fought a civil war, they would lose. And so you have a negotiation where leading plebeians and leading patricians sort of negotiate the terms under which the entities set up by plebeians to be dominated by plebeians and make decisions based on, the consent of plebeians and the institution set up by patricians negotiate with each other because neither one can afford to actually have a conflict. But the other thing about this is this notion of citizenship, right? So there is like my immediate self-interest as a wealthy person in Rome is to not throw down and have a fight about this. Because, whether I'm patrician or plebeian, I'm going to lose a lot of money. I'm going to lose a lot of standing. I might die. There's no point in having a civil war. But also there is that sense of this belongs to all of us and we're renting it. And if we throw down and have a civil war because of our concerns at this particular moment, we're destroying the things built by our ancestors, and we're leaving a worse product and a worse society for our kids. Even if we win, we're destroying things. And so I think there's two things going on here. One is, the immediate like short-term risk makes violence something that doesn't really make sense for any of the leading people who would orchestrate the violence. But then second, there's a longer term proposition where, their duty to Rome is to not do this. Their duty to Rome is to figure out how you peacefully negotiate some kind of collaborative compromise or solution to whatever argument you're having. And sometimes it takes a really long time. Like in one case, it takes almost 10 years of kind of political paralysis for them to reach some sort of negotiated settlement. But they get there. And they get there because this isn't a class struggle. This isn't the middle class trying to overthrow the upper class. It's the upper class fighting with the upper class about how to make decisions, in a fashion where they are relatively equally positioned.
How is the Republic aristocratic counter-revolution? Like, why is it that phase in the story that the aristocrats strike back?
Yeah, so with Tarquinius Priscus, who is this Greek and Etruscan king, he solidifies his power by actually relying upon a military commander who's he's kind of like a mercenary adventurer type who was born a slave. And so he has even less social capital than Tarquinius Priscus.
By the way, I'm going to put that on my dating profiles now. Mercenary adventurer type from born of humble means.
Yeah, there you go.
I
Right,
like that. I
mercenary
like that.
adventure types are,
Yeah,
they're coming back, right?
exactly,
More of
exactly.
a market for them now. Um, yeah. So basically,
Well,
when
yeah, I mean, you recruit them all for ICE. By the way,
well,
I
there's
remember saying
lots of
these.
options now, right? You can go fight for Wagner. You can,
Yeah,
fight here. Like there's all kinds
it's
of demand for this all of a sudden, right?
absolutely
um, yeah, it used to be like in the '90s, you'd have to go and take over the Comoros or something if you wanted to.
right, right, right. But now, yeah. So yeah, you were saying. Sorry,
Yeah,
before I interrupt you.
so basically, what happens is when Servius Tullius, who is this military commander, when he takes over as king, he would never get patrician approval. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. And so he knows he's not going to be selected in any kind of a process. So he doesn't have a process. What he does is he basically says, I'm king. And then he goes to the plebeian assembly and he says, do you approve of me? And they say, yes. And so what he had done in essence is he'd taken the patricians out of the equation for deciding how leadership was chosen in the Roman state. And he'd gone straight to plebeians. And so the revolution, and then he built all sorts of structures that undermined patrician traditional power in religious and social contexts by redefining, religious life, redefining the sort of breakdown of groups within Roman society. And patricians feel totally disempowered by this. And so when you get the next king, the seventh king, Tarquinius Superbus, and he starts behaving tyrannically, what patricians realize is there's a way to kind of reset things and to remove these structures that had weakened patricians and in a sense like recalibrate the state so that now not only do patricians again get the kind of direction in who's going to be leading, but also they can prevent anybody from stepping in as an individual who will again kind of recalibrate the state in favor of plebeians. And so what the republic is designed to do is get rid of the kings. And then once you get rid of the kings, build a structure where patricians are deciding who's going to be in charge and making sure that only patricians are eligible to be in charge. And so it's a patrician counter revolution in a sense because it's trying to undo the stuff that had been done by the last two kings, but also create structures that prevent anybody from coming in and doing those things again.
When I'm reading the book and you're telling the story of how, and again for listeners, I can't recommend the book enough. It's just sweet, and this is a 2,000-year story you're telling, which is just absolutely remarkable. It's amazing that a state, I mean, all states die, but 2,000 years, it's a pretty incredible run. But you talk about Julius Caesar, and he seems to me to be a part of like Rome's greatest generation, right? If I
Yeah.
was doing the Brokaw book for Rome, I think this would be a good candidate for the greatest generation. And there's all these great Romans up and around Caesar, but you kind of know that Caesar is a guy. He's worried about the decline of the republic. Some people would see him as autocratic and having, but he values the republic still. He could probably defend some of the moves that people might see as undermining the republic. Because I'm undermining it to save it. I still value the republic.
Yeah.
I still like the republic. This is different, it seems, with Augustus. He's a different kind of figure. There's somebody that doesn't seem to romanticize or have this ideal of the Republican Rome, and he's a transitional figure. What makes Augustus different?
I think there's a couple of things. I think the biggest thing is he's a different generation than Caesar. So Caesar's generation comes of age during the civil wars that Sulla wins and that end up with massacres of Romans. And what they believe is that the republic is the ideal thing that Rome should have, right? And that what Sulla did is terrible, but they don't trust that the republic can actually do what it's supposed to do. And so that's the fundamental tension they all have, right? Cicero, Cato, Crassus, Caesar, Pompey, all of these guys desperately want a republic that works, but they don't trust that it can work. And so as you move through their careers, you see further and further erosions in the functioning of the republic to the point where in the late part of the 50s, Pompey is basically put in charge of this as a sole consul so he can guarantee public security. And when Caesar wins the civil war and takes over as, you know, the leading figure in Rome, that's what he's replicating, is this image of Pompey as, you know, the stabilizing force in the state, because he's so powerful that nobody's going to challenge him. What Augustus realizes is it doesn't work, right? Like Caesar did that and Caesar got killed because people don't trust that that is a stable political structure. You can't have the republic with some guy who's just so powerful that he makes the republic work. What you need to do is, you know, make it so that, first of all, if you are that guy, you're not going to get killed. And that, you know, I think Augustus sees in Caesar's biggest mistake was in pardoning all of these guys so you could rebuild the republic and thinking everything's going to be okay. So Augustus doesn't do that. What Augustus is really interested in doing is creating some kind of an actual position that isn't just I'm going to float above the republic as the republic works and just be sure everything's fine. Instead, what he's going to do is create a position for himself that guarantees his security, but does it in a fashion where, like, all of the different workings of the republic that are essential for what Augustus wants to accomplish are under his control, and nothing else is. So he doesn't want to be responsible for stupid stuff like fixing streets or, you know, making sure that the port is dredged, or, you know, all of this like little stuff that's annoying. The Senate does that still, right? The Republic still functions. But if you're going to talk about like who controls the armies, well, that's him. And so what he's looking to do is build a structure where he's kind of like, I don't know, a parasite or a tumor or something, right? Like he's embedded himself in all of the different parts of the republic so that the republic cannot survive without
Yeah,
him.
just no emperor thinks, you know, one day when they write my story, they're going to say, I was a great parasitic tumor. That was a transition point to imperial power.
And I think, honestly, he wouldn't have used that metaphor, but he would have understood the sentiment. Because what he does is he basically says, yeah, like there's going to be there's going to be a budget, right? The Senate, you know, and people are responsible for administering the budget. But like my private money, which includes, because when he conquers Egypt, he gets all the territory that used to be pharaonic land, right? All of that land that belonged to Cleopatra becomes his. So he's as rich as a king with his private wealth. He's the whole budget of Egypt, more or less, with his private wealth, plus all of the other things that he's accumulated from taking property from adversaries and other things. And he uses that as a discretionary fund. So if there's a food shortage and Augustus is happy, he will use his money to provide food for those people. If those people have made him angry, he won't. And it's his discretionary
This
money.
is like today, right?
It is exactly like today.
This is
Yeah.
exactly what we're living to today, right? Okay, we're going to cut off the funding to the Democrat cities. And this is
Except, you know,
maybe Trump is reading more books than I thought.
it's even scarier because the thing that's key to this is Augustus does this for the military. You know, he pays military retirement benefits out of his own money. And what that means is, you know, if he dies, those soldiers can't retire. They know it. And they are professional soldiers. So, you know, the other lesson that he learned from Caesar was soldiers that are experienced, Roman soldiers that are experienced, can defeat Republican like conscript armies that are like 5 times more numerous than them because they're just better. And so Augustus realizes you don't need to have these massive armies that you had under the Republic if you have professional armies, because quality outstrips quantity in this context. And he has professional armies. You could not raise 1 million Roman troops to actually defeat Augustus's armies, even if you wanted to. But if you did, those armies would be loyal to Augustus because he's paying for them and he's paying their retirement personally. And so, you know, he's created this structure where you have a public resource. The army is a public resource, but he's embedded himself into this resource in such a way that that resource will be used for public good when he wants it to be, but it ultimately will answer to him instead of sort of these larger principles of like what the public wants, because he has made himself essential to them.
One of the things that I was thinking about, so I was reading the book and thinking about, and also thinking about lessons to learn are things that we should be aware of in our own context in the United States right now. Is it you know the average citizen in the wider republic, like when this thing, I mean, because you think, oh my gosh, there's this glorious republic, and that we look back on in Western history, and then it slides into an empire, and oh my gosh, how can this happen? And who's watched as it do these things happen? I mean, that for the average person, like if you were one of the 600 people in Rome that's making decisions, your life changed a little bit, right? You've got your the way that you conduct your affairs. But for the average person, right, Augustus is making some certain things work, and for the average person, they're like, I mean, come on, republic, empire, bread, circuses, I'm eating, things. I mean, is that? I mean, and I wonder, should that worry us as Americans? that when the average person, what their day to day life doesn't change all that much, and
Yeah.
so it seems like for the average person, the republic's not something hugely to be mourned over against a more imperial form of state.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is actually a great way to go back to the question we started with about like what do you see when you write these histories that go across centuries and millennia. I think what you see in the Roman context is representative democracy is not a binary; it's a spectrum, and so under the monarchy, this is still a representative democracy in a sense, right? Even under the monarchy, citizenship matters. You have a role in choosing who's leading you. You have a role in deciding what they're going to do when they're doing it. Um, the republic, when it starts, is probably about on that same level if you're a plebeian. It's way more free if you're a patrician. It evolves so that it maybe moves, if we think of like the Economist Index, where like North Korea is like a 1 and Finland is like a 9, you maybe are with the monarchy, maybe like, I don't know, a 3, you move to maybe a 5 or 6 with the republic as it sort of progresses. And then with Augustus, you move back, but you don't move to North Korea. You move maybe from like a 6 to a 4. And this is true, actually, after Augustus, the state lasts until I think 1204 AD with the Crusaders. In 1203 AD, the Emperor Alexius III writes to the Pope, and this is on the advent of the Fourth Crusade, sort of getting ready to go and attack Constantinople. And the grounds that the Fourth Crusaders are using is there's a deposed emperor who has like shown up in Western Europe and is asking to be restored. And under Western rule, this guy never actually held power, but he's the son of someone who did. Under the rules that Western monarchies set, like he should be restored, right? Because he's the son of a king, so he should have the throne back. And the Emperor Alexius III writes to the Pope and says, "We don't work that way. Our office is a magistracy, and it's entrusted to us by representatives of our fellow citizens, right? And so this is not, even then, even 1,200 years after Augustus, this is not an autocracy. It's a version of a representative democracy. It is not the republic, right? It is not like a 6 or 7 on that economist scale, but it's also not a 1. And so I think the history of Rome is actually a history of like moving back and forth across that scale. It's never totally free. It's never democratic Athens, which even then I don't think would reach a 10, but it's never democratic Athens, but it's never North Korea. It's always moving in that spectrum. And so Romans are always able to say, yeah, citizenship matters. And maybe it means something different in 100 BC than it does in 100 AD or 1100 AD, but it matters. It always matters. And I think that when you have the shift under Augustus, they noticed, they understood that something really significant had changed. It bothered a lot of people. But also, they knew, because Augustus knew, you couldn't declare yourself a king, right? You couldn't create a Hellenistic monarchy where you do not have this accountability with your citizens. You could not govern as somebody who's not a magistrate, because that would be intolerable to Romans, because you would have broken something so fundamental to who they think they are that, the state would not have survived. And he knew that. And so he, like everyone who follows him, or almost everyone who follows him in imperial power, works to not kind of jump out of the middle of that spectrum.
You gotta stay with the myth, the DNA of the founding myth, right? Something
Yeah.
like a lesson from your book, right? That there's a DNA there through all the evolution, all the changes. It's remarkable that from the 8th century all the way to say 1204, we can see that it's the same DNA.
Yeah,
For all the changes, and part of that DNA is citizenship, is an
right.
ownership of the polis. That is remarkable.
So, when you think about those changes, right? Like Christianity could have broken that, right? How do you have a sense of citizenship that's grounded in pagan gods? And you actually have people like in the 4th and early 5th century who
Yeah,
say
sure,
this,
sure.
like we've broken with what
Yeah.
we have always been. And, and yet,
And they sometimes they say that when things go badly,
oh
right?
yeah,
This
the sack
this
of
is
Rome.
this is because we backed the wrong horse. The gods are
Yeah.
angry.
And yet they still last for another 800 years. And in the East, like they don't have a problem with this. How do you change from a place that spoke Latin to a place that speaks Greek? How do you move out of Italy and center your government in Constantinople, right? They can do all these things because there still is that basic sense that we're operating as part of this, collective enterprise. And if the collective enterprise means we're making this decision and everybody through the kind of representatives who are entrusted to make that decision goes along with it, okay, we own it. And that I think is remarkable. That it is just that connective tissue of we own a stake in this thing that is so old and has gone back so far. And it's our job to make it better than we got it. Like that basic story tells, that is the story of these 2000 years. And it
Yeah,
tells us
that's
a
one
ton.
thing. I think that for me, if I had to say like what's different after reading this book, is that one of the things that it challenged me. I think a lot we have Western prejudices just because the way we're educated in the movies we see and the stories and Rome is part of the when they say the whole thing, dudes like Rome, right? The whole thing, dudes like Roman history, right? So I mean this sense of subject, right? The
Yeah.
subjects of the empire, and for me that concept of subject was replaced by stakeholder. That the whole story one of the central drivers of the story for me in this sweeping history of Rome is the stakeholders. That one of the things that makes this thing go that maybe Sparta can't quite figure out, Athens can't figure out, and all these other rival and contemporary empires can't quite figure out is how do you enfranchise people so that they're stakeholders,
Yeah.
right? And that capacity, and some of it's the inclusion thing, some of it's the addition and subtraction, but you're not making subjects as much as you got stakeholders, right?
Yeah, and I think there is a phase in Roman history where they do have subjects, right? Like I mean, they make a choice after they win the First Punic War. They now have Sicily, and it's really big. They have Sicily, and then they very quickly get Corsica and Sardinia. And like, what do you do with this? You've built this whole commonwealth in Italy around citizenships and allies that is really cohesive. And Sicily is big, and it's made up of people who are very different. They're Carthaginians there, there's Greeks there, there's Sicils there. There's all these people that are very different, and do you absorb them all at once, or do you govern them? And what Rome decides to do is neither. It basically says, well, we're going to possess you and we're going to take stuff from you, but we're not going to include you in the way we did Italians. And that starts about 500 years almost of negotiation about how do we deal with the fact that our citizens are exploiting subjects, and this is on some level inconsistent with how we do things. And what Romans very quickly begin to acknowledge is we can't work that way. What we have to do is gradually kind of take the people who are the best in these provinces and bring them in as
Mm-hmm.
citizens and then senators and then ultimately as emperors. And this creates a momentum that in 212 AD leads to the extension of universal citizenship to everybody across the empire. But it's in a sense a natural correction to these choices made 500 years earlier, right? It's a realization that we actually don't want a system where there's 60 million people in the empire and 50 million of them are subjects. Like our system doesn't work well that way. And what's remarkable is like in the 2nd century still, you have revolts like the Bar Kokhba revolt where people are looking to leave the empire. And in the 3rd century, there's a huge problem with the government maintaining control of its territory in the 250s and 260s. And what you get is not revolts to leave the empire. You have people in the Northwest and in the East who decide the central government is not capable of protecting us, but we still want to be Roman. So we're going to build a Roman entity in our territory that will protect us as Romans. And this ultimately comes back together as, as the empire in the 270s. And it's almost seamless, because this process of integration that was interrupted by the decision to, create subjects, it's not natural for Romans. And it's actually very natural once you reverse that process for them, for the tendency to make people stakeholders to just sort of move very quickly and very meaningfully and very powerfully to create, I think what we could say is almost a proto-nation state.
And Constantine, real religious conversion or like a politically calculated move to consolidate power and and do some religious branding in the empire?
100% real religious conversion.
100%. Everybody,
100%.
Ed Watts is a gospel maximalist and
Yes.
100% believer. There's not, this is an
No question.
authentic. All right.
No
Why?
question.
Why, Ed?
So I
Make
think
the
I think
case.
I think I can give you an argument and then give you a story. So I'll give you the story first, and then I'll give you the argument. The story is, in 284 they set up a system of government with four different. Well, in 293 they set up a system of government with four different emperors, and Constantine is in control of the northwest of Europe when this system is breaking down. And what he realizes is he has, of the options, that's the worst option, right? It's the poorest part of the empire. It's the least urban. Not coincidentally, there's the fewest Christians in it. And he decides he needs to march on Rome. He needs to take over Italy, and he needs, to do this, or he's ultimately going to die in whatever civil war follows from the collapse of this system of government. And we have a story that I think makes total sense, where he says, I'm embarking on this campaign. I have roughly the same number of soldiers as the guy who's governing Italy. He has been fortifying the cities in northern Italy, and especially Rome. He's also beaten back two other invasions by basically staying behind the walls in Rome, waiting for their supplies to run out and then attacking and defeating them. And I need help. And so the story is Constantine says a sort of general prayer, to any gods, any god, please help me.
This isn't the movies where you see someone say, if you're up there and you're listening,
Yeah.
please do something and I'll turn my life around.
And yet this is totally like when we have examples of like Roman pagans praying, they do this, like Aelius Aristides in the 2nd century tells us this story of when emperors are fighting in Syria, he prays to his normal gods. He prays to Zeus and Ares, because that's the god of war and the god of kings. And he prays to the gods who hold Syria, whose name he doesn't know, but it's just sort of throwing a prayer up. And Constantine gets a vision in response to his prayer. He doesn't know what it is. He sees something in the sky, doesn't know what it is. And then he has a dream where Jesus appears to him and says, put this on your standards and on your shields and go into battle. And he does. And when he goes through northern Italy, he basically like rolls through northern Italy, and turns these defenses that are really significant defenses. And then he gets to Rome, and Rome is, because it is so large, because there are so many people in it, you can't effectively surround it with the force Constantine has, especially since he's also now garrisoning his home territories plus territories in northern Italy. And so he's just basically sitting there. And as you get to the end of the summer campaigning season, like the end of October, the emperor in Rome, who has literally, like, if this was a video game, he's won the video game 2 other times, right? He knows how to fight this level. He's sitting in Rome, and he just decides not only to march out from the city, but to cross the Tiber and fight with the river to his back. And our sources have no way of explaining why an experienced commander would make that sequence of stupid decisions. And in the battle, he ends up losing the battle. He ends up drowning in the Tiber, and Constantine wins this victory. So what human with that story would not convert to that religion?
People have converted for far less.
Yeah. I mean, it is like logical, right? The causation is not irrational there. If you are Constantine, you 100% believe that you were promised something, you did what was asked of you, and you got exactly what was promised. Why would you not convert to that religion? And, and then the argument beyond that is there is no political advantage to converting to Christianity. It's like a 10% of the population religion, and most of those people are in the East. Constantine's in the West, right? What advantage does he have for converting to Christianity when most of the territory under his control has so few Christians that we hardly see martyrs in there under the Great Persecution? Like it's no power base for him that is going to be a useful power base. Um, so this is, I think, sincere. But I think the other thing that we miss is in a pagan world, especially the pagan world of the early fourth century, you can embrace the Christian God, and it's not a problem for paganism, right? Gods are gods. And you do have pagans who acknowledge that Jesus is a god. And so if you're a pagan and you're looking at this, and we actually have on the Arch of Constantine, it says that he won through the inspiration of the divinity. And what is that divinity, right? It's up to you to decide. You can, as a pagan, read that as, divinity generalized. You can read it as Sol Invictus. You could read it as Jesus. Christians read it as Jesus. Constantine, I think, read it as Jesus. But if you're a pagan, and we have pagans who talk about Constantine's religion in, even in the 320s and 330s, and they talk about it as, piety, and piety that is consistent with what they see as piety, because it is. And so, so I think that there's no reason to think that Constantine isn't sincere about this. And none of his behavior suggests anything that's like cynical or, strange. What he's doing, I think, is personally practicing his religion, using his position as emperor as a bully pulpit to encourage people to embrace Christianity. But again, that job is a magistracy. And so when he's doing things like serving as Pontifex Maximus, he's doing it because that's part of the job. It's not, a cynical political statement. It's, yeah, I mean, I personally do what I do. And then there's this stuff that I'm responsible for. And so those two things, like I can say to you, become a Christian, but I'm not going to use my magistracy to force you to become a Christian. And if we step back from like a modern perspective and we look at like what is the fourth century view of this, what he's doing is totally fine. And there aren't Christian bishops saying there's a problem with what you're doing.
And so one of my favorite theologians, maybe my favorite, Karl Barth, said during the 30s and the 40s, he was active in the resistance movement against Hitler. You knew Bonhoeffer and stuff like that. But he said that he tried to do theology in the 30s and the 40s as if nothing was going on. Now, I mean, he's got to be saying that at least partly tongue in cheek, right? But people get what he's saying, right? That there's this fidelity to the task of what he was doing that gripped him, right? And the Sturm und Drang of everything. I mean, I wonder, we're in a pretty volatile time right now, right? I mean, we're in the United States where people feel as though the Republic may be in danger, that Donald Trump is something different than just presidential executive overreach, that this is, gosh, I mean, I was at one of the No Kings protests here in Philly. It was huge. I mean, millions, something like, 2%. I forget what the percentage of Americans. It was pretty high that participated. Are you doing history like nothing's happening? Are you doing it in a sense, or do you have a renewed sense of energy or crisis? Right? I mean, I wonder how working in ancient history, which I mean, one of the reasons we study it, right, is for perspective on who we are and where we are. I mean, how is writing history, teaching history different right now for you?
It's a terrifying moment. So I mean, some backstory to like where this book was written. Part of this book was written right in Italy, right before the election of Maloney. A significant portion of this book was written in France, where I think the Fifth Republic is really struggling. I mean, it's not clear if how long the Fifth Republic will even last. And a significant portion of it was written during the Biden administration. And the book was done more or less when the election happened. But I think that it's a danger to do any kind of history where you are coming at it with a kind of preconceived notion of what you want to say. Your sources will tell you a story, and you can read those sources multiple times and see multiple things. And so there's one example of a source that I love that I teach pretty much every year I teach this source. It's a speech written by a pagan rhetorician in the city of Antioch, right around the year 390, when the Emperor Theodosius has allowed the governor of the East to travel with an army and monks who then are going around what's supposed to be an inspection tour and destroying pagan temples in the countryside. And this author writes about this, and I have long sort of seen this as, this is an explicit critique of kind of violence and the use of pretexts to inflict violence. I was teaching this just after the inauguration, when Doge was doing its thing. And what I realized is that this speech is a critique of violence. It is what I have always taught it to be, but it's also something else. It's actually an indictment of an executive that's refusing to actually do what it's supposed to do to protect its citizens. An executive that is pretending it doesn't know what's going on and pretending it doesn't have any ability to restrain it because it's ignorant. And what Libanius is saying, what this rhetorician is saying, is that's actually worse, right? Your obligation is to be honest about what's going on and to actually use your power, even when things are kind of unclear. Use your power to restrain them just in case something bad is happening. I'd never seen that before. I mean, I've read this thing easily 40 times, and I've never seen that before. It doesn't mean what I saw before was wrong. It just means I saw something new. And so I think our obligation in this moment is not to say, I am really unnerved about what's going on in Italy or France or the United States or Britain or India or wherever you feel unnerved. Our obligation is to read what we've got and use the experiences that we're having to read that stuff anew, even if we've read it 100 times before, to read it anew and see something different, because we now have experienced something different. And we, as observers of a 21st century reality, can understand something that somebody was saying 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whatever, because now we have a new experience that pings for us when we see it echoed in that source. And so I don't think that I'm actively writing a narrative. Any of my history is actively writing a narrative to address things now. With Mortal Republic, initially I was going to try to do that, and the material just kind of took me where it took me. And that material took me pretty far away from where I thought I was going to be. And I think that was good, actually, to not have the restraint of writing about the now and, just allow the material to go where it goes. But I think we also can't put our head in the sand and not acknowledge the things that we are noticing because we never have experienced them before. And we will see new things, even in material we're very familiar with, just because we're like that river that always changes, right? And every time we change, we have the capacity to see something that we didn't otherwise know existed. So I think that's our obligation right now. We can't pretend nothing's happening because it's a lie. We can't. No one can live that way. But we also can't write something that is a story of the past that's deliberately in response to something that's happening now, because that also, I think, distorts some of our material. What we should do is, be aware of what's going on around us, but also be aware of how we read the material we're interacting with, and we'll get something that is new. We'll get something that has never been done before, just simply because we have experiences and we are noticing things that the people who wrote about this stuff hadn't experienced themselves and hadn't noticed before. This is why I think, incidentally, this is why I don't think history will ever be AI'd away, because you have to be a human to see those things. You understand an element of the human experience each time you have a human experience. And when you read your material, that human experience is what unlocks the things that are most valuable in the material you're reading. No machine can ever do that because it isn't human. It doesn't have those experiences. It can recapitulate what you already said, but it can't bring anything new to the analysis or the conversation because it's not capable of doing that.
Ed, I learned a lot of new insights. I'm a better human with richer experience for reading the Romans, a 2,000-year history. Thank you so much for writing this book and for coming back on the show to talk about it.
Thanks, Scott. I'm happy to come back anytime. These are always amazing conversations, and I love the range of things we cover in them. So thanks for that.
You're most welcome. We'll definitely do it again.